12th, 2021. Mr. Raymond Ross from Hottentots Holland High School, and tonight we're going to look at the second topic, which is a topic on independent Africa, and here we are going to use Angola as a case study. Now, why did Angola become an extension of the Cold War? Angola was the Cold War playing off in Africa, and that is why it became so important to world history. Why? Because it had minerals. Angola had the following minerals. They had oil, they had diamonds, they had gold, also uranium, copper, and the fishing industry were huge, and the Americans and other countries were very interested. So at first, Angola wasn't part of this sphere of influence until it became known that they have minerals. And so the Portuguese started off way back in the 1480s to show interest in the trade with Angola. And then at the Berlin Conference in 1885, the control of Portuguese over Angola were formalized, and they took charge of Angola. So in 1951, Portugal considered Angola to be an overseas province of Portugal, which is silly, but it worked for them. It didn't work for the people of Angola, obviously, but they didn't know. They also used a policy of assimilation, whereby they would take people from Angola and assimilate them into Portuguese culture, and vice versa. So Portugal rejected calls since the 1950s for independence of Angola, because they obviously had the benefits. Why would they give Angola independence? So a war of independence took place between 1961 and 1974, and then there was also a coup of pro-democratic people inside Portugal. They tried to actually get Angola's independence from Portuguese side. In 1975, the Alva Accords were signed, but this were never honored by either the Angolan parties or the rest of the world, because elections were set for the 11th of November 1975, and this never happened. So now we're going to look at why the Civil War, and actually the actual Civil War that broke out in Angola in 1974. There were three liberation organizations that emerged within Angola. The one was the MPLA, and they had their headquarters in Luanda. The one was UNITA, and they had their headquarters in Ohambo. And the one was the FNLA, and they had their headquarters in Ambrits. Angola's Civil War became a proxy war in which the East and the West played out Cold War politics. Now you will understand why I mentioned that the world is intertwined. There's no way one can get along without the other one. So what was the reasons for international involvement in Angola? The USSR supported liberation from colonialization. Also, the USSR saw a means whereby they can get communism to spread through Africa through Angola. The USA, although they had a policy of containment, they feared the spread of communism in the region, and that is why they secretly sent arms to the FNLA and UNITA. Obviously, the USSR would support the MPLA because they had a communist policy. USA supported the FNLA and UNITA, and the United States Clark Amendment of 1976 called for the reduction of involvement in Angola. It was repealed in 1985, and funding resumed for the organizations who fought against communism. How was Cuba involved? Castro wished to spread the Cuban Revolution to everybody and to all countries in the world. And when the MPLA asked him for help, he saw an opportunity. China of all people were also there. Now, if you think that it is only now that China is huge and in the news because of Corona and COVID-19, you're badly mistaken. China was involved already during the Cold War in Angola. Now, why was the Chinese there? They were committed to the anti-imperialist struggle and to prevent the spreading of the USSR policies and influences. So here we have three countries, USA, USSR, also China, and Cuba, four countries actually, all outside from Angola with an interest in Angola. Now, where does South Africa fit in? South Africa, our country. The National Party was in charge, and they had a policy of destabilization in the region, that whole region, because they wanted to stop the spread of communism, and they wanted to destroy SWAPO bases in Angola. Why SWAPO in Angola? SWAPO was the liberation organization in Namibia, but South Africa controlled Namibia. So SWAPO had to fight South Africa from another country, and they used Angola as a base. So there was one battle, especially between South Africa and Angola, and where other countries got involved, that made a huge impact on the world, and that was the Battle of Cuito, Cuanavale. It happened in 1987 to 1988, and even today people are debating who won this war or this battle. Not a war, but a battle. The SADF helped UNITA and the FNLA, and they attempted to take control of Cuito, Cuanavale. It was a small town but with strategic importance. When we talk about who won, you have to take a multi-perspective and a multi-perceptivity, because South Africa will tell you they won the war. The Cubans will tell you that they won the war. And when you look at these two viewpoints, in the first viewpoint, it was a defeat for the Angolan army, or FAPLA, by UNITA and the South African Defence Force. On the other side, the USSR and the Cubans, or on the same side, they were forced to withdraw from Angola. That's the one point of view. The other point of view is that South Africa, or the SADF, were defeated by the Angolan army, and that the Cuban forces forced them to withdraw from Angola. So you need to understand that it depends on where you're coming from and how you look at this. If you are South African and you are loyal and whatever, you are going to say that the South African army won. But if you are a liberal person and you believe that it was good that the MPLA actually still control Angola, then you will probably support the other point of view. So a lot of different treaties were signed to get Angola's independence. I'm not going to go through all the treaties because your teacher will probably do that in class and talk about some of them, but there were the New York Treaty, and that was the negotiations about the independence of Namibia. There were also, part of this treaty was the withdrawal of all foreign troops from Angola. So that would include South African troops, Cuban troops, the Chinese, the Americans, and also South African troops. It didn't fan out that well for Angola. So there were still people fighting, although there were all these accords and treaties that were in place. In 1994, there was the Lusaka Protocol, whereby international pressure were put on the different countries to actually withdraw from Angola and give Angola the independence. 1998, there was the 4th MPLA Congress. 2002, Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA, were killed. And in 2002, on the 4th of April, a memorandum of understanding were signed, whereby Angola would have their independence. The struggle for independence in Angola was a long and hard and winding road. Sounds like a song. Angola does not border South Africa, so why were they interested in this war? At this point, you need to understand why the South Africans became military involved. South Africa, the major reason was that they wanted to stop communism. But it was more that South Africa, Angola's economy, was integrated with South African economy and other economies in Africa. And if the communists took over, South Africa would lose out on the economy. Angola is potentially one of the wealthiest countries in Africa. International capital is still involved in this fierce competition for the resources. It is one of Africa's leading oil producers, and before 1973, it was a major diamond and coffee source for Africa. And with a population of just over 8 million, it has been underpopulated since the time of the slave trade. So here you have a country rich in resources and minerals with a very few people, only 8 million. And other countries saw an opportunity for them to gain from the situation. Portugal was so poor that it could never fully exploit the resources that this colony presented to them. And so it opened the way up for other exploiters to come into this country. The United States investments, they dominated the petroleum trade, the British capital in diamonds, and the Benguela Railway, German capital in the iron mines at Kasinga, the Japanese, the French, and all other countries, a lot of other countries had an interest in the resources. This multinational character of capital in Angola meant that Portugal was de facto and in administering this colony, so they couldn't handle it anymore on behalf of all European economies. So they started to also look at the Americans for help. So South Africa had its first defeat in Angola from 1975 to 1976. The anti-colonial struggle in Angola started, and this led to a coup in Portugal, and it was a turning point for South Africa. South Africa tried to intervene, and they had help from the CIA by land, sea and air to stop the MPLA from coming to power. The Angolans asked Cuba, and so the Cubans sent troops. And in 1987 to 1988, there was the siege of Cuito, Cuanavale, and there's a lot of people who say that South Africa were humiliated. What the real truth was, only the people who were there will be able to tell us, but we take the evidence from history, and according to the evidence, South Africa lost that battle. But in 1976, there was the defeat at Luanda, and then in that same year, in Mozambique, or a year earlier, they also lost a war in Mozambique, and it inspired the next generation of people in Angola to stand up against colonial rule. After the defeat in Angola and the uprisings in Soweto, South Africa had different interests, because they now had to fight a war in their own country with their own people, because the youth in Soweto was standing up. South African troops were called in. They were not needed in another country anymore. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and give you a few minutes just to breathe before we do the last part of this whole Angola episode. Thank you. And we are back. So, we have just said that we spoke about Cuito Cuanavale, but that will come later again. So we have to just take a few steps back. There was a war in 1976 to 1980. In this period, South Africans were on the defensive, politically and diplomatically. But they were staging a massive military build-up in Namibia, because they didn't want SWAPO to take over the country. They began conscription, so they asked young white students just finished with school to join the army, and they forced them basically to go and fight in this war. They constructed new military bases. It was a whole build-up, but it didn't help them very much, because the Southwest African People's Organization, or SWAPO as you would know them, had moved its headquarters from Namibia into Angola. So thousands of youths dodged this conscription thingy. Not all young white people were willing to go and fight in a war that wasn't theirs, because it wasn't a war in South Africa. So at this point, the South Africans organized UNITA. UNITA was there. It was this organization, liberation organization in Angola, but they were never organized. So instead of them fighting in Namibia in Angola against the MPLA, the South African Defence Force sent people in to train and to structure UNITA into a fighting force. And it had previously just been wandering all over Angola with no structure. And now they had a clear mission. They know what to do. The role of UNITA changed drastically when the Carter administration in the USA persuaded the Chinese to give 8,000 tons of weapons to UNITA. So as you can see, when we spoke about the Cold War the other day about the spheres of influence, we said that these two superpowers, USA and the USSR, they would not fight a direct war. They would help other countries with weapons, start deals, so that their war is an ideological war. They know what they want, but they don't physically want to get involved. At this stage, with this 8,000 tons of weapons, UNITA felt very, very strong. They felt like they can take on the world. And this is what then happened. This kind of weaponry enabled UNITA to wage a conventional war. They can now fight, against another force. The officers were trained in Morocco. They were trained all over Africa in military strategy by the South African Defence Force. This was a strange twist of history for UNITA. For its first weapons that they got from SWAPO was pathetic. They couldn't actually fight a conventional war. So UNITA was used to track SWAPO and walk behind them in this war, and now they had to take the lead inside Angola. It was in one of these raids that the South Africans carried out on Kasinga that a massacre happened. 800 people were killed at a SWAPO refugee camp. So people that were already refugees were just killed, and people don't always talk about it because it put the South African Defence Force in a very bad light, and that happened in 1978. The ensuing international outcry about what happened here and the adoption of United Nations resolution, remember this one, you're going to get it in the source base, 435. They will ask you, there's a whole source of it in one of the previous papers. Resolution 435 in 1978, detailing steps leading to the independence of Namibia because of this international outcry of what has happened to SWAPO. So this resolution entailed the following. Firstly, the withdrawal of South African troops from Angola and Namibia, the return of all Namibian refugees to Namibia, a United Nations supervised election, and the granting of independence to Namibia. Now Angola has a problem. Remember, they used the SWAPO bases, especially UNITA, to fight against the MPLA. With Namibia getting independence, SWAPO will become the government, and they can't hide inside Namibia anymore. So they had to fight from inside Angola. So I said we're going to speak about Cuito Cuanavale again, and that is what has happened there. So they actually lost the battle here with the South African Defence Force. So the Lusaka Accord was signed in 1984. It was just after the next major South African invasion took place in 1983. Here UNITA announced that it had taken Kambango. Now, Kambango was another strategic point in Angola. The South African Air Force destroyed it, and the rubble was handed over to UNITA. So UNITA actually inherited or got only a bunch of rubble and not a town that they tried to claim to the world. They have captured this town. So South Africa wanted UNITA to take Cuanavale so that the front of the war could be driven northwards. Its self-confidence was heightened by its invasion in Grenada, and when the anti-communist rhetoric in the United States reached its peak, incredible peak, UNITA thought they were on a very big high. Unfortunately, it was a lie to the rest of the world. And then the South African government intended an all-out attack on the capital, Luanda, the base or the basis of the MPLA. The South African generals thought that it was operationally possible or impossible to take Luanda, but Magnus Malan faction within the State Security Council wanted to intensify the war. So even in South Africa, there were conflict within the ranks of the army on what is possible and what is not possible. So although the generals told their chief that we can't win this war, he still forced it ahead. The resulting accord was, or they lost, obviously. The failure to take this had the Angolans feel that they are now very strong, the MPLA. And so a resulting accord was signed after and named after the Zambian capital called the Lusaka Accord. It set up a joint military commission to oversee the withdrawal of all South African troops from Angola. The third period of this whole battle for Angola happened in September from 1984 to 1987. It started in September when FAPLA forces started to drive against Jamba near the Namibian border. South Africa intervened, but the uprising in the townships, they were actually forced to carry out their battles on their own, and they called upon the United States to help them. The United States were in a tough position. They supplied Stinger missiles to UNITA, and also $15 million in additional aid. UNITA itself lacked the administrative and military infrastructure, so they couldn't use either the weapons or the money appropriately. And all this money went indirectly to the South African army and to the South Africans who used it. The South Africans worked from the coast of the battle, and they told Savimbi, who was the leader of UNITA, to ask the Americans to pay more money. The United States also reacted to the base at Kamina in Zaire, and here the CIA was dropping off supplies to help the South Africans through UNITA. The United States support for UNITA, and in essence the SADNF, or the SADF at that stage, they weren't the new army that we have today, led to the final stage of the war, the United States could not support UNITA anymore. Now you need to understand the one part that we didn't look at is, at this very same stage, there was a collapse of communism. And when the collapse of communism happened in 1988, 1988-89, in Europe and specifically in the USSR, there was a problem. The United States fought communism and thus the MPLA, and so they supported South African government who were fighting this battle against the MPLA. They hated apartheid, and we spoke about this yesterday on the previous video also. They hated apartheid, but they supported apartheid because they feared communism. Now there's no more communism. So the United States didn't want to back UNITA anymore, thus also not the SADF anymore. And that is when the final stage of this war happened, with the withdrawal of the South Africans. And when the South Africans withdrew, the Cubans withdrew from Angola, and Angola could fight their own battles and become independent. I hope you've learned something, and I hope that this helped you a little bit. Remember, this will be source-based. So the case study on the Cold War in Africa is going to be source-based. You will get sources. You can relook the video when you read through some sources and work through some old papers, and then some of these things that I just said now, told you about, will make a lot more sense. But most of the answers will be in the sources. Thank you.